Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading true, creepy backwoods stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. Hey there, Backwoods Creepy. Long-time reader here. I had a friend call me on Friday who knows that I'm into this kind of thing. They were in shock at what they'd seen and wondered if I had any idea what this could be. I figured that I would share it here to see if anyone has any ideas. Here is what they shared with me. They were camping at Heart Mountain Hot Springs at 6:45 a.m. They were leaving their campsite by foot to use the nearest bathroom. The campsite sits above the field overlooking the road that runs west to other campsites. A field, creek, and 3 hot springs pools. As they were walking out of their sight, they looked across the field and saw an animal. It was at least 200 feet away. They thought that it was a wild horse, but there were no wild horses in the Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge. This animal's body was facing them, south, with its head turned slightly to its left. They thought that it was a horse because it had a black mane of hair and its body was brown and shiny. It appeared to be about the size of a yearling at first. They say at first because later they saw a human man in the same location. There's a path there from the west campsites that travels to the parking lot by the east campsites. And they now believe that the creature was 7 to 8 feet tall. It turned its head, right, directly towards them. Then it turned its body leftward, east, and walked across the parking lot toward the bridge, across the creek, and then they lost sight of it in the trees. It was bipedal. It did not move quickly, walking with its back slightly forward and arms swinging at its sides. They later looked for footprints. The ground was too hardened to find any. They crossed the bridge and walked a little bit up the creek, north, looking for any evidence, like hair, and they could not locate anything. What do you think? My only thoughts are either a person dressed in some kind of ceremonial gear or animal skins, although the height makes that very unlikely. Or an animal with chronic wasting disease, which also seems unlikely, given that it was bipedal. When I went to college, I befriended a professor of mathematics. He was one of the most intelligent, eloquent, and articulate people that I've ever known. A remarkable family man who married in his 20s with a daughter and a son. He never drank or smoked, never used drugs, never permitted himself to curse, raise his voice, or become aggressive, even in disagreements. He was always in control, always punctual and on time, always organized and very disciplined. And he wore clothing that would not look out of place at the turn of the 20th century, and he acted like a true gentleman. I'm just telling you what kind of a man he was. Not a crazy man, not a junkie, no mental illnesses. I had the pleasure of taking advanced algebra, calculus 1, calculus 2, and differential equations with him. Anyway, we had this STEM club room in the math department where students hang out to study and chit-chat. And sometimes our professor would join us for help with tutoring, homework, exam study help, and just discussions about various unrelated topics. One time he told us a story about when he saw something strange in the woods. This happened during the 90s when he was a teenager. He lived in Quincy, California during that time, and he had a hobby of driving his dad's old beat-up truck all over the Sierra Nevada mountains, just for exploring. and also for hunting animals and gathering wild berries. He liked following old mining roads and seeing where they led. One such time, he was out looking for blackberries to pick. It was getting late and the sun had set, so he was driving down this narrow road when he saw that there was an obstruction in the road. It looked like someone had stretched a gigantic plastic bag across the road. He thought it might have been a construction work or something. As he drove up to what he thought was a plastic bag stretched across the road, he stopped his vehicle within like 40 feet of it, and he saw that it was not a plastic bag. It was some kind of screen or curtain, a two-dimensional flat shape, stretching over the road, perpendicular to it. It was a rectangular shape, with the width of the road and about 1.5 times in height, and he saw that it was translucent, like some kind of hologram. It was like semi-transparent, because when my professor shone a flashlight through the rectangle, the light penetrated through it, illuminating the road past it, but just barely. Like the light only went a foot or two beyond that screen. It was just standing or floating there, and yet it was not attached to anything. It held its own weight, but it was like weightless at the same time. Its surface was like wavy or rippling. My professor got out of the car to investigate this strange floating rectangle. He went right up to it, and as he did, it was like it was emitting a vibration or low humming that he could feel in his bones. There was an effect that the closer to the rectangle, the stronger the vibration was on the objects around it. And as he got close to it, he saw the hair on his arms standing up, like there was some kind of energy in the air. And there were dense trees on each side of the road, so he couldn't go around this rectangle in the middle of the road. He went up to the trees and broke off a branch. He then poked the branch into this rectangle, and he saw subtle ripples going up and down through the rectangle from the place where he touched the surface. And he stuck the stick all the way into the rectangle, and there was no resistance. But he didn't see the stick going through the other side of the rectangle. It was like it disappeared or became invisible. And then he pulled it out, and the stick was unchanged, not burned or deformed. Not knowing what this rectangle was, he went back to his car, continually looking at the rectangle. He didn't want to risk driving through the rectangle, so he drove his car in reverse until the road became wide enough to turn around and head back where he came from. To this day, he doesn't know what it was. He said it looked like a two-dimensional shape, like a semi-transparent rectangle stretched across the road, perpendicular to the surface of the road. He didn't even know that it was possible for a two-dimensional shape to be floating like that, but he saw it with his own eyes. I don't know if he ever went back there to find out. He didn't elaborate. He didn't even say where exactly this was. This was just when we were chatting in the club room after 6 p.m., doing homework or just resting and eating snacks. And I never got back into contact with him after graduating, moving out of that college town, and then the pandemic hit. I don't know, but I suspect that's one of the things that pushed him to become a professor of mathematics. Seeing a rectangle in the middle of the road. That's not something that happens every day now, is it? Anyway, that's all I know. Hey everyone. So this was 24 years ago in Nova Scotia. I was sitting on my grandma's porch having breakfast. It was still early dawn. Forest was darkened past the clearing about 200 feet from the house. I saw these largest green eyes high up in the trees looking at my direction. After 20 minutes, I walked inside for a few minutes to clean up, and I came back outside to nothing. I've tried looking for what sort of critters live out that way, with green eye shine. Cougars are rare in Nova Scotia. Possums in the area are extinct. Any regular explanation for tree-dwelling large green eyes? This has been bothering me ever since it happened. I'm writing this post while the incident is still fresh in my mind. It occurred around midnight of Saturday, September 2nd. and each day that goes by, I feel more unsure about what I really heard that night. To preface, this took place in the Olympic Peninsula, along the Hood Canal. My girlfriend's parents recently bought a beautiful riverfront property in a rural area, down a private gravel road that has a few other houses here and there. Their property is heavily forested on all sides, though the neighbors' houses are vaguely visible to both the left and the right. The night was winding down after watching a movie. Everyone had gone to sleep while I lay awake playing on my phone. The windows were open, letting in the pleasant sound of the river bubbling outside. Close to midnight, I started hearing splashing in the river, which startled my dog, but was easily explainable as elk or deer crossing the river, since the area is very wild. However, after the splashing subsided, I started hearing a repeated animal cry that sounded like a sort of bellow mixed with a scream or a yell. It's hard to remember exactly at this point in time, but it was deep, not like a cougar or a fox screaming, and fast in cadence. Definitely odd, but still explainable as an animal. This happened for around 10 minutes or so, intermittently with what sounded like a huffing or snorting sound. I was alert at this point, listening and trying to calm my dog, who was unsettled by the sound as well. As I listened, it started moving closer, at first sounding like it was across the river, but now on the right side of the house. As it moved closer, it transformed into what sounded like a human screaming for help, in the most deranged and unsettling way possible. Like it was screaming help, but it couldn't quite form or enunciate the words correctly. It literally gives me goosebumps thinking about it right now. At this point, I was thinking, what the heck, and woke up my girlfriend. We listened together in silence and rushed to wake up her parents when we both heard a pronounced help in the scream. Both dogs started going ballistic, and the screaming stopped at some point in the commotion, so her parents didn't get a good grasp on the sound. After shining flashlights out the windows, we went downstairs and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. After a sleepless night, we woke up and walked the perimeter of the property and found no sign of animals or humans. I was half expecting to see bloody human remains or something with how intense the screams were. I imagine that's what a person being axe murdered would sound like. At this point, I really regret not going outside, armed, to investigate, as I've spent the past 2 days constantly racking my brain, trying to figure out exactly what the heck that was. I've looked into every animal sound out there and haven't found a single thing that actually sounds similar to what we heard that night. I'd probably think I imagined the whole thing if my girlfriend hadn't heard it as well. I'd love to hear any thoughts and or similar experiences from this community. The very first time I went to my boyfriend's family's house, we explored the very wooded areas around his house, 30 acres of land. Some hunters go in, but no hikers. Only old logging trails which the original owner of the house probably created. A lot of the trails are not well maintained, with brush and logs all over them. One area my boyfriend wanted to show me was off trail. I hate walking off trail. I hate bushwhacking. And this was in the spring, so there were ticks. He brings me to a huge boulder that he calls Dragon Mountain, normal boulder, near a very small stream. He climbs up, and then helps me up. It was much taller than me, but by no means gargantuan. We sit on the boulder, then lie down looking up into the trees, talking. I'm on the left, my boyfriend is on the right. I don't remember if we heard the crunching of the leaves first or saw them first, but to our east, 3 adult men, all wearing black or dark navy blue from head to toe, in sunglasses, are walking toward the boulder, carrying a long black tube. All 3 of them are carrying it together, and none of them are talking. They're just walking, carrying this thing. My boyfriend and I are extremely still. We did not get the urge to say hello or say anything to them, like we would to normal people that we encounter hiking in the woods. They're walking towards us, but we don't think that they can see us, because we are lying in a sort of large divot in the top of the boulder. We can hear the men walk behind where we are on the boulder. Then, when they are to our southwest, very near the boulder, they completely stop. They do not talk or make any noise. Naturally, my boyfriend and I stay silent and still. We are looking at each other, trying to take this all in. It felt like a long time that there were no walking noises. The men then walked sort of around the left of us and the boulder, then walked off towards our northwest. They were still not talking at all, just walking through the woods, holding their black tube. We were very weirded out for a long time after this, and we got out of those woods pretty quickly in a direction away from them, opting to get to the road and follow that home instead of taking the quickest route towards the house, which was pretty much in their direction. We've both racked our brains for years about this, coming up with all kinds of explanations. My boyfriend later realized that the direction that they came from is a major highway, where there is a fence as well. We conjectured there may have been hunters, with the black tube being a device to carry a deer. But a lot of hunters live around there and tend to wear camouflage in orange, not all black or navy or dark colors in general. I get if they were hunting, they would likely be quiet, but they did make a fair amount of noise with their footsteps. Why did they stop? It just did not seem like three normal guys going through the woods. I forget all about this encounter periodically, but when I suddenly remember it, I cannot explain why I felt the way that I felt. We both had the instinct to hide and be silent.
This happened when I was growing up around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside of Olvade, Texas. The town itself was really small back then and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that isn't really on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting with him. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy. I hated it. All I had to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive obviously took most of the day, so we got there early in the evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin and the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in scouts for a couple of years, and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So, after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guess was about an hour. When we woke up, it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs, and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by the trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there. Not to mention, the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright-colored red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all, dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 degrees outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnap the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were really only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down, watched him circle around to the front of the man, all the while talking, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man. My dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" He called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there, staring. As I got closer, one thing stood out to me the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than a day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him getting worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew that my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panic tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the lease possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought that I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week, he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone. No mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks that it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely top 3. And whoever was out there, I'm sure glad that we never met.
My encounter happened in February of 2007. I used to work third shift at a paper stock factory warehouse. The main day shift supervisor was on vacation, so our boss on night shift decided that she wanted to leave early. So she let us sneak off about 2 hours earlier than our normal shift end time. So this would have been between 4:30 to 5 a.m. I was following a coworker down this country road, as the warehouse was on the outskirts of my small rural town. I noticed he hit his brakes and proceeded to swerve off the road. I'm probably about 100 feet behind him, and I'm thinking to myself, what the heck is this dude doing? And that's when I saw it. There was a tall, dark shape strolling down the middle of the road in a hunched over and swaying side to side sort of manner. I have likened it to how one of those tall windblower figures you see swaying at a car dealership or something like that moved. Very unnatural movements. I can't do it justice by describing it, as it would only really make sense if someone saw it themselves. It looked like a tall person wrapped in a large, dark blanket or cloak. I had to hit the brakes and swerve too, but I came to a full stop. Whatever it was, I couldn't make out any features or characteristics. I saw a large torso with 2 legs. The upper half was hunched forward as if it was leaning like an older person would with a walker. Now, at that time, I was driving a 1998 Ford Explorer, and I've looked up the height of that vehicle, and it lists around 67 inches. But whatever walked past my driver's window was a good foot or more higher than that, leaning forward. So I believe whatever was walking was over 7 foot tall minimum. Again, I could not see a head, any arms, just a figure with legs walking. My taillights illuminated it as I started to drive past it. I couldn't make out any definite details for the body. I didn't see any fur, skin, or anything like clothing. It was solid, not like a translucent type of thing. It was just large, thick, and black, or at the very least dark gray in color. My coworker had pulled over into a parking lot a little ways down the road, and I followed him in, and you could tell that he was scared. He was saying something along the lines of, "What was that? It didn't have a head," amongst a lot of other things that most panicked people say. We decided to drive back down and try to see if it was still there, and it actually was. I drove in front and he was following behind. We come up to the general area, and I noticed there's a large black animal laying in the middle of the road. It appeared to be a big black dog. Part of me knew that it wasn't large enough to be what was walking in the road, but we had to stop because it was directly in the middle of the roadway. I decided to get out and walk up to it. All the while, my coworker is yelling at me to get back in my vehicle. As I approach whatever it is lying on the ground, it brings its head up and looks back at me. Its eyes are glowing yellow, which I write off as eye shine from the headlights, but it growls at me. So I stop dead in my tracks and just watch. This thing stands up on its back legs like a person, but falls back down. It sits back up and hobbles off to the side of the road like a wounded animal that wasn't able to use its front legs. It looked like your typical German shepherd / wolf type face, but its fur was puffy like a chow dog's. It was a lot bigger than most dogs, but still, nowhere near as tall as whatever was walking down the road. I didn't see any blood or wounds, so I can't say if it was actually hurt or not. My coworker got out of the car by this point, after it had disappeared into the wood line. We discussed what had just happened, but while we were talking, I noticed next to our feet was a mouse. It was just standing there with us, but it was cleaning itself. I nudged it with my shoe, and it just kept cleaning its face as if it wasn't afraid of us. The mouse was sitting in an upright position, as in it was on its hind legs and using its front paws to wipe itself. I never really considered it until recently that all 3 of these bizarre happenings were all on 2 legs. We got back in vehicles and drove off. Then, the next time at work, I had mentioned what happened, and our coworkers laughed at us. So the other guy who saw it told me if I don't stop talking about it, he's just going to deny it, and I best just forget it. So, for essentially 15 years, I never told anyone up until recently. I've tried to rationalize it into something that makes sense, but even then, it doesn't completely add up. I've tried to explain it away as it was just a large dog that must have gotten hit by another vehicle before my coworker and I got there. Maybe it was messing around with a mouse, and it got hit, which broke its front legs, so that's why it was trying to use its back legs. The mouse was traumatized from the dog trying to mess with it, so it was just standing there cleaning the dog slobber off of itself. That sounds at least plausible, until the original thing we saw walking without a head. The dog was nowhere as tall as that thing was, so even with the dog standing upright, it was close to 6 foot, roughly, but whatever was walking had to have been over 7 foot tall, as it was so much taller than my Explorer, even with it hunched forward. I can explain away the dog and mouse, but I can't just explain what that was. So, I'm back at square one, trying to understand what it could have possibly been. As someone who's always been very skeptical, it becomes very hard to accept the unacceptable. I've always been interested in weird creatures and such, but I never truly believed that they existed. I still struggle to believe that all these crazy stories could be true. And yet, who am I to say that they aren't? Especially with the weird stuff that my former coworker and I went through that night. All I know is what I saw. But whatever I saw is something that I don't know and probably never will. It sounds crazy, and I personally would be very hesitant to believe it if someone else told me that this happened to them. But that is what happened.
I am a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight camping trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple in and out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel on his part left me on my own. So, with a packed bag and car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time and some trouble navigating through forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45, which for those of you who don't backpack, is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast, so I figured if I moved quick enough, I could still get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. The strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually, it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get my camp set up. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot. But there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood, and I got the fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike had almost gone away, but it was still there. It's just a side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything on the edge of that circle and past it are pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating my dinner when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I looked at the tiny rock in shock, as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light on and towards the area where I'd seen the rock come from, but due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for whatever or whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from my fire that in hindsight offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got as I came to the realization that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. I couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I've almost shit my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line in the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options: stay here and wait out the night, or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out here with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light. So I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night there. Eventually it came back. I could hear it walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could hear it. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes it would walk too far away and I would lose the sound of its steps. But then an hour later, maybe 2, it would return, still faint as ever. This went on for about 3 or 4 hours, until I listened to the steps get closer and closer until they were about 7 feet away from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there, still, for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand, and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed the things and speed walked the 3 miles back down the trail that I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and drove and didn't stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see and or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what was written in the dust on the back window of my car. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far, so I thought I'd share it. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you possibly can.
I'm not sure that this is the appropriate forum, since what I thought was a scary encounter turned out to have a totally normal explanation. But anyway, here it goes. I had bought a house with a steep backyard that sloped down 40 foot to some thick woods. In the fall, I started building a retaining wall to get a level space. I mostly worked on it in the evenings after work. At this particular time, I was cutting a trench in the hillside to lay in a dead man. If you aren't familiar with the term, a dead man is simply a log or railroad tie laid in a trench parallel to the wall, further up the hillside. Cables are run from it down to the wall through the dirt. The dead man acts like an anchor to keep the wall from bowing out from the weight of the earth it is holding back. Anyway, this night, I was hurrying to get the trench finished. I had put the railroad tie in the trench, and it wasn't lying flat. So I pulled it partially out, with one end resting on the edge of the trench, and was digging underneath it in the bottom of the trench with a hand towel. The sun had set, and it was really getting too dark to work. It was one of those cold, crisp autumn nights, with dry leaves skittering along pushed by a hissing wind. The moon had come up over the horizon and was shining through the trees. I was lying flat on the cold grass with my arms digging at the trench under the railroad tie. I had just about decided to quit for the evening when I felt my hand get grabbed by something from the bottom of the trench. With claws. I shrieked like a little girl. That old fight-or-flight reflex started with vengeance. I must have levitated to my feet and was just about to push the railroad tie back into the hole to crush whatever the heck it was that grabbed me. I hesitated for a moment. In that instant, my neighbor's cat poked his head up from the trench. It must have crawled in, unnoticed, from the other end of the trench, and had been attracted by my digging motions. That cat never knew how close it had come to being flattened like a pancake. I've had a few other weird incidents in my life, as I imagine most people have, but this was the one that I remembered that scared me the most, and yet had the most mundane possible explanation. There's a little hot springs nestled near the peak of the Passamaquoddy Pass in central Idaho. Though it was hidden in plain sight, sitting quite literally on the shoulder of the road, it's not a well-known attraction outside of the valley, but the local ranchers are quite familiar with Barney Hot Springs. It's not unusual to drive by on weekends and see several families enjoying the water. Barney Hot Springs, or simply Barney's, is incredibly remote, even for Idaho standards. It's at least an hour of driving over rutty dirt roads to the small town of Salmon to the north. If you need a hospital, it's over 2 hours to the regional hospital in Idaho Falls to the south. To say you're in the middle of nowhere at Barney's is an understatement, but the seclusion is one of Barney's major drawing points. That and the odd abundance of tropical fish swimming in the year-round warm waters. You can sit back, relax, and take in the surrounding views of the mighty Rocky Mountains with little in the way of distraction. But Barney's isn't all it seems to be on the surface. An event 40 years ago turned this little hot spring from a local retreat to a local nightmare. On the afternoon of October 27th, 2 truckers stopped for fuel at my parents' gas station and cafe in Howe, Idaho. They were hauling a load of hay over the Passamaquoddy Pass, headed for a delivery point somewhere in Utah. As the truck fueled, the 2 men settled down at the cafe counter and ordered coffees. Sipping his coffee, the older trucker struck up a conversation with my mother and the regulars in the cafe. He seemed a bit on edge, but was normal in comparison to his younger partner. That young man was clearly shaken and didn't say more than a quiet, "Yes, ma'am," or "No, ma'am," to my mom. He kept his attention on the cup of coffee that he cradled in his shaking hands. As the older trucker and the others conversed, he brought up a peculiar event that had happened to him that afternoon. They had crested the Passamaquoddy Pass and were coming down into the Little Lost Valley. As they approached Barney Hot Springs, standing in the middle of the road was what looked to be a child. Bringing the truck to a stop, they soon realized in horror and fascination what was before them. It was not a child, but an odd humanoid creature. Its body was slim, with long, slender limbs and a squat little torso. The head and eyes were large and amphibian-like. It was not standing any taller than a preschooler. They could see its green skin shimmer in the brilliant midday sun. Dripping with water, it was clutching a large bundle of what could only be described as hundreds of eggs. The creature watched the truck come to a stop, then awkwardly walked over the rest of the road and down an embankment. It was obvious from the trail of water that it left behind that it had just come from Barney Hot Springs. On the other side of the road was a small stream hidden in dense willow bushes. No sooner had the creature disappeared, the 2 truckers were driving away as fast as their Cummins engine would take them. My mom and a few regulars at the cafe took in the man's story with silent, somber expressions and comforting head nods. This wasn't the first time that strange things had been witnessed in the Little Lost Valley. Of course, a frogman carrying his brood certainly was the most unique story that they had heard in a long time. The regulars told the truckers not to get too worked up over the incident, as it could have been the autumn sun playing tricks on their eyes. The reassurance seemed to calm the men. They finished their coffees in a few quick gulps and headed out the door. My mom and the regulars had a good chuckle over the men's story and went on with their day. The following morning, on October 28th, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded in Idaho history struck the area. The Bora Peak earthquake was a magnitude 7.5 and could be felt hundreds of miles away. It destroyed farm infrastructure, roads, and bridges. It was a horrific and frightening day for everyone in Idaho. Barney Hot Springs was not far from the earthquake's epicenter and did not escape its wrath. A couple of passing visitors near the springs that morning watched in amazement as the water drained into the earth, leaving behind a stinking, mucky hole. Minutes later, to their further astonishment, the water came splashing back into the depression, but was now boiling hot. It was a truly bizarre geological event to see. The boiling stopped immediately after the earthquake ceased, and the water at Barney's quickly cooled. It's now more of a warm springs, having permanently lost about 15 degrees of temperature after the earthquake. The Frogman has been seen a handful of times since that initial sighting, always near Barney's, and almost always standing in the road. I like to think that the Frogman was just a doting parent getting their babies out of harm's way before the earthquake struck and annihilated everything in the hot springs. Barney Hot Springs is still a wildly popular spot for the locals. No one seems to be too bothered by the idea of sharing the water with a little odd amphibian man and his family. Someone even reintroduced the tropical fish after the boiling incident killed all of them. It remains just one of the many weird stories to come out of the Lost Rivers area of Idaho, where I grew up.
I've spent my whole life in Georgia, and I love hiking all over, but I must admit, North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, I frequently drive up there to hike and camp. This time, I went up with my family in an RV and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountain Trailhead, and I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I had never camped alone. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I won't go without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous, not necessarily steep. I've hiked some steep stuff out west, but more like a ton of ups and downs and feeling like it would never end. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized that I needed to stop and set up while I still had light. So I stopped about half a mile short of the summit and figured that I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't really eerie at the time, but it soon would be. I have trouble sleeping and usually lay awake for up to an hour trying to sleep. During this, I thought I heard someone slightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the steps. I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull my big old knife out of my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. That morning, I woke up and ate oatmeal. As I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries, tied with green cord propped up against my tent. But I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes. In no way I bothered going to the summit. I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended and I was lost. I used a compass to eventually reorient myself, and I found the trail again. One of the biggest reliefs. I made it out with no other incident. However, come to find out, that same morning, a 27-year-old died on the same section of trail as me, and it's possible that I would have run into him had I not gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. His family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles on him, but I'll see if I can find something. The scariest part was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me, and I had no clue about them. So this happened last year in Virginia, and is also the reason that I never backpack alone anymore. I was taking summer courses at the time, and we ended up with a 3-day weekend in June, so I thought it was a great time to explore some of the Virginian wilderness. I did a Google search, and I found a state park with a trail that looked nice, and let my roommate and family know the trail that I was going to be on. When I got close to the park area, I saw a little outdoor shop where people hiking the Appalachian Trail stop. I went in to grab a map of the area just in case I got lost. As I was talking to the owner, he mentioned a trail that's not well known that has a pretty cool waterfall and swimming hole. This piqued my interest, so I had him show me on the map. It took me outside the state park, but he said it was a great place to go. I paid for the map and thanked the owner. I texted my roommate and parents about the new trail, and I parked my car and set off on my new adventure. I should note that the waterfall was going to be a side trip from my journey. I was planning 3 days and 2 nights. I started on part of the Appalachian Trail, and it was pretty packed with people, and some of them were really fun to talk to. As expected, as I got further and further from the main trails, I saw less and less people. Around early afternoon, 3 miles from my destination, I noticed it was unnaturally silent. No birds, no bugs, not even wind, and I had a feeling of being watched. I shook it off as me overanalyzing the situation. I got to the waterfall, and it wasn't too spectacular, but it was cool to look at. Plus, it had a good-sized area to swim in, so naturally, I stripped down to my skivvies and took a dip. It was pretty refreshing. As I was just getting back my clothes on, I started whistling to myself. It was Chill Bill because it was stuck in my head. That's when I heard something whistle the same tune back. I thought it was a bird copying me, so I went back and forth with it, and it'll repeat whatever I whistled. I thought it was pretty neat. As I was setting up camp, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched again. Like, I'd get goosebumps and my hairs would stand up. As night fell, I built a small fire and lit my jet boil to make dinner. As I did this, I became super hyper aware that, again, there was no sound, just deafening silence. Some part of my brain was telling me that I'm not safe and I needed to leave. I ignored it and crawled into my tent with my flashlight and book. I went to sleep without incident. When I woke up the next morning, my site was trashed. My camp stool was nowhere to be found. My bear bag with my food was cut down, and the contents were thrown across the site. My first thought was a crafty animal chewed through the rope and got at the bag, but I looked at the rope and it was cut with something very sharp. Plus, none of the food was even touched. I also noticed bare footprints all around my campsite. Keep in mind, I'm at least 6 to 8 miles from a road. As I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap off in the distance. I turned to look in that direction. I saw nothing, but I heard that whistling again. My whistle from yesterday. But it was different. It sounded more sinister. It made my hair stand on end. It sounded like it was a little off in the distance, so I packed up my camp as fast as I could. The whistling got closer as I finished stuffing the tent into my bag. I didn't bother with putting anything away properly. The whistling was incessant and sounded like it was coming from all directions. I got fed up with the whistling. I stood up and I yelled into the woods, "Shut up." It stopped whistling and it was quiet for a moment. Then it repeated what I said in my voice. It sounded just like me, but distorted, like it came from an old TV. After I heard this, I immediately threw my pack on and ran in the direction that I came from. I heard it moving just behind me, fast, switching between the whistle and my voice. It felt like it was toying with me, not coming too close, but not getting too far away either. Eventually, it sounded like it got further and further away from me. Then it stopped suddenly. When it stopped, I stopped and turned around. I wished I didn't, because I heard the most bone-chilling screech ever coming from right next to me. That's when I started running again. I didn't look. I only ran. Less than half a mile, I ran into a couple of people that were also backpacking. They saw the look of terror in my face and asked me if that was me that screamed and asked if I was okay. I told them about what happened, and they decided not to go down where I just came from. We moved to a more populated trail as quickly as we could. As soon as I got back in my car, I drove to one of the park rangers' stations and reported what happened. Since the site was off park grounds, they told me it wasn't in their jurisdiction, but that they would send a ranger to investigate. The ranger station's parking lot ran right up into the woods, and when I was getting into my Jeep, I heard the Chill Bill tune coming from the woods just in front of me. I never drove so fast in my life. When I told my roommate why I was back after only one night, all he said was, "Bro, I'm never going camping with you."
Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Have an excellent night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video.